A touch of the 1983 Scholastic 300 race returns here to Amaroo today. George Fury won the event last year, and the pole sitter today is, of course, Gary Scott of Queensland, driving for the same team. You must be delighted after some stirring performances here early in the season.
Very happy, Mike. The car's running well, we feel good, and I think we're as confident as you like to feel at this time of the day.
Well, the weather is certainly with you as well.
Yes, a little cooler. We don't mind a bit of rain. The little car loves the rain, as George Fury proved at Lakeside, and I think the tougher the going gets, the better the car will like it.
We're not far away from the start. What runs through the mind of a driver? You're planning the start. You've got Jim Richards alongside of you on the front row.
Here, Mike, you're very conscious of getting a clean start and settling into a pattern very quickly so we don't have some incidents that we've had in the past. It's a circuit that lends itself to that, and I'm just hoping for a clean getaway, a nice tidy run for the first 15-20 laps, settle onto a pace, and then I think the race will fall into a pattern, and we hope to be at the front of the pattern at that stage.
What sort of lap times you look at running, say, maybe an hour into the event?
Oh, I think 54s, 55s are pretty realistic. Days like today, with the weather changing, it's hard to say, but I think this condition, if it stays like this, just light drizzle will help the V8s a little bit. It'll make their tyres live longer, but we'll just have to wait and see.
You're going solo in the event. George Fury went solo last year, so that's a good omen.
Yes, I'm going solo. It's my first solo endurance race, and I feel fit enough to do it very well, so we're looking forward to it.
Good luck to you, Gary.
Thank you, Mike.
Gary Scott, he's going to have a lot of Queenslanders riding with him, of course, in the Scholastic race coming up. Final comments now from Dick Johnson. Well, he looks in pretty good shape for this race, Dick.
He certainly does, and the lighter cars around here really do have an advantage because of the fact that the tyre wear is very critical, and a driver in this type of race must really pace himself right from the first drop of the flag to the finish of the race to be able to continue to keep a fast enough pace to win the race from.
Brock's back in position number 5. When do you see him making his move?
Well, Brock will go very hard in the early stages of the race, I think. He's only got a certain life in his tyres, and I feel that Brock, being the experienced driver that he is, will utilise that to the maximum. And as for the other drivers too, like Steve Masterton, he will utilise his tyres while they're still working and working well. But the weather could play, you know, a different game again.
With it. Well, settle back and prepare for the running of the Scholastic 300. We'll take a commercial break and then return for the start of the 1984 Classic. Welcome back to Amaroo Park Raceway as the field gets away for the start of the Scholastic 300. 155 laps, the opening round of the Endurance Championship, and going up over the top and dropping down into Dunlop Loop is the pole sitter Gary Scott of Queensland, who will lead from Jim Richards. Then making a move up through the pack very quickly was Ron Gillard. Back behind them is Peter McLeod going through. Peter Brock caught out behind them. Steve Masterton is the next one through, but already the pole sitter Gary Scott of Queensland through Mazda corner and heading down to the left-hander at Honda corner. Down through the gears is Richards, not letting Gary Scott get too far away. They're probably a car length then back to 35. Ron Gillard and then Peter Brock, who has made up some ground to make it into 4th place. Next is Peter McLeod, and they were then followed by Ron Harrop. Look at this for the challenge. Jim Richards, the wet weather master, coming through on the inside as they come out of Wonderlick corner. 154 laps to go. And it's Jimmy Richards, expatriate Kiwi, who will lead up Bitchapave Hill the next time around to drop into Dunlop Loop. That great shot of all the cars going through.
Practice yesterday, he sounded so confident. He's got his car running so well, and that was evidenced in that first lap. He takes the lead from Gary Scott and the Bluebird. Gary Scott is a man who has performed so well at this track. He really likes it here. There's the turbo running really well.
The big point is that Gary Scott and Peter McLeod, who got off the line quickly but have dropped back to Richards, of course, are running on slick tyres. Most of the other front runners are running on intermediate tyres, rain tyres, so until the track dries out, you won't see a great deal of forward progress from Gary Scott. He'll try and hold station, but at the moment, the fellow out in front is the wet weather master. And if this track stays like this for the entire race, you could see Jimmy Richards coming up with a win in the Endurance Championship round. Back across the strike, 2 laps completed into the race. And Jimmy Richards in the JPS BMW heads up the hill. There's Gary Scott, and he's holding out Ron Gillard in the Mazda RX-7. Peter Brock in the 05 Commodore is the next one up behind them, and then Peter McLeod. through Dunlop Loop. Just driving very, very cautiously while the track still has that almost an oil lint over the top of it. Is Gary Scott. Jim Richards, with the use of intermediate tyres, will establish, I would think, a fair lead at this stage in the event, heading down to the lake corner. Scott has, of course, Ron Gillard not that far behind him. Peter Brock is up to join them, and a long way back then to Peter McLeod and Ron Harrop, and next being Terry Finnegan. If they keep the hoses going on this circuit for the Scholastic 300, the fellow up in front will revel in it. Jimmy Richards looking for a win, and a major win for Frank Gardner and the JPS BMW team, doing comfortably at this stage. Couldn't have wished for better weather with a light fall of rain just before the start.
Must get a lot of rain in New Zealand, do they, Mike? He likes the wet weather.
This bloke thrives on it. I tell you what, he's a very good driver as well in the dry. Almost a calamity on the front straight. We'll get back to that for you later as we pick up on Race Cam, of course, that we bring you exclusively on the 7 network as part of our motorsports coverage. Steve Masterton driving the car, and almost an anxious moment for Masterton as they came up on one of the Mazda drivers who half slewed across the front of him. I think it was Tony Cavich. And Masterton really had to weave and get his way out of trouble. Now he'll have to come back through the pack. So that'll give you an idea of what the drivers are having to put up with in the early stages of the Scholastic 300, presented, of course, by Dow Corning here at Amaroo Park Raceway today. Through the corner, a short run down to the lake turn. Still the drizzle continues as Masterton in the big Ford, unable to use all of that power because you can't get it down on the racetrack. Let's have a look at the race leader and how he's doing. Just look at it, extending that lead. And Gary Scott at this stage having to contend with Ron Gillard and a Mazda RX-7 behind him.
That's the race leader, though. Jim Richards doing it very comfortably in these conditions. Pretty slippery, as we've seen in earlier races today, but Jim's just reveling. Down into the lake corner he goes.
Look at that, Steve, with almost a change there with Scott, Brock, and right behind Brock, the surprise man is Ron Gillard. He's been able to catch up behind Brock. As they say, you know, a few of the fellows who run here regularly at Amaroo Park Raceway and set up their cars can really play havoc with the pros who maybe visit here just once or twice a season.
That's what Jim Richards was telling us, that he sets his car up especially for this track, and he feels that the advantage he gets is round through the Dunlop Loop. He's got this track pretty well worked out, and that's obvious today. Enjoys it in all conditions. But we're watching Peter Brock and Gary Scott. Brock right on Scott's tail, and you can bet your boots that Peter Brock's not going to let
the Bitcher Pave Hill. Brocky 0-5 up into second place going through. What an interesting race at this stage with Richards running away with the intermediate tyres on. Brock in second. Third is, of course, Gary Scott, and there's number 35, Ron Gillard. Co-driving with him today, Mark Gibbs.
So it looks like Gary Scott's being made to pay for that choice of slick tyres, isn't he? Because Ron Gillard right on his hammer and looking for a way past Gary Scott. Into the lake corner they go. Gillard right on the tail of Gary Scott.
At least keeping the pressure on him. Well, the track conditions to the average viewer at home would appear appalling. A man with the knowledge of track conditions and a fellow who does quite well on the wet at most circuits is our pit reporter today, Dick Johnson. Well, Dick, what's the problem?
Thanks, Mike. We have a problem here with Gary Wilmington being the first guy into the pits, and nobody likes to be the first guy into the pits. He has trouble getting top gear. It won't go into top gear, so unfortunately he's in a position now where I think it's ready and he's away again. So back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Dick. Well, the problem that he has faced, of course, is a critical one so early in the race. This particular point, we've got Jim Richards still leading. Second spot being held by Brock, third by Gary Scott, and, of course, Gillard back in fourth place. Here's Brock coming through. The man who started off going after the Australian Touring Car Championship earlier this season, had to back out of those commitments, of course, because he made a total commitment to running at Le Mans with Larry Perkins. Things didn't fare all that well for them, although they certainly were up amongst the leading contenders, but just bad luck took them out of the race, and I'm sure that they'll be back there next year. In the meantime, it's back to the bread and butter business of touring car racing in Australia. And, of course, Peter Brock at this stage is starting to close just a little with Jim Richards just ahead of him. Oh, there's Richards going through, and Brock. So Brock is narrowing that gap back to Jim Richards.
Yes, Brock looks like he's closing the gap on Jim Richards. Gary Scott early in the race was slipping back and not able to get anywhere near Richards, but Brock looks like the man who's going to just sneak up behind Richards and give him something to worry about. Certainly at this stage, though, Jim Richards very comfortable. We're watching Brock trying to make up that leeway.
Peter Brock, once again, across the line, still trailing Jim Richards as they head up to the top part of Nissan Skyline, dropping down into the left-hander. In the pit area, overseeing our action today is Dick Johnson. Well, Dick, it would appear that the choice of tyres for Jim Richards on intermediates at the start of this race was a wise one. What's the word about Peter Brock and what he is running on?
Well, Peter Brock, Mike, is running exactly the same type of tyre as Jim Richards. As most of the cars in the race, as far as I could see, there was only 2 cars that didn't have the intermediate tyres. One was Gary Scott in the Nissan, and the other was Peter McLeod in the Mazda. So I would say that probably with a few more laps under their belt, when the track starts to dry out a bit, these 2 guys could probably give the front a really bad time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. Well, there's the gap, and it's narrowing between Jim Richards, race leader, and the BMW, and Peter Brock stalking him now, starting, of course, back on the grid in the 5th spot, but up to 2nd. So Richards down into the left-hander at Dunlop Loop. And Brock, well, long-distance races are the forte of this man with 7 wins in Australia's most prestigious race, and that, of course, is the James Hardy 1000. There's Steve Masterton in trouble as Jim Richards goes past. Now Brock has to deal with Masterton on the outside. They also come up on one of the slower cars in the left-hander coming down to the lake. And sweeping down there on the inside goes Peter Brock. A fascinating race at this stage with Richards, the master in the wet, and Peter Brock gaining. There you can see the conditions have not improved at this stage. Not too many dry lines around the circuit. And the weather could really do anything, breaking up just a little above. And if it does break and the track dries out, well, Dick Johnson has already said you can expect a charge to the front from Gary Scott.
It's interesting to think that you know, while Peter Brock is the king of endurance racing in Australia, you'd immediately pick him as a man who knows how to pace himself. But he's also a man who likes to go very hard very early, and that's what we're seeing today. Started on position number 5 on the grid, and already there he is knocking on the door of Jimmy Richards. So he's going hard nice and early. It'll be interesting to see how these 2 handle each other over the next couple of laps. Jimmy Richards catching up on a slower car there, and this could be Brock's chance to give Richards something to worry about as they both try and get past this slower car.
They come back onto the straight here at Amaroo Park, and Peter Brock has been playing the waiting game, stalking the race leader Jim Richards in the BMW as they head up Bitchapave Hill again. They pass the slower car on the inside. Brock also takes it now, and Richards will be first down into Dunlop Loop. And Brock has been able to pull back a deficit of about 150 metres. Richards is running in the tight line coming out of the corner as they head down towards the bottom corner. Down through Mazda corner, Brock again, just sitting behind Richards, just following in his wheel tracks. Look for any dry parts of the course. There's not too many at this stage. Now Richards comes out of that corner. Brock now with the superior power of the V8 will look for an inside pass, perhaps under brakes. No. Side's better of it. Will probably set up to give Richards a run. Maybe I would think up Bitchapave Hill the next time. They come into Wonderlick corner. Race leader in the Scholastic 300, Jim Richards in the BMW, but under pressure now from 7 times Bathurst winner Peter Brock as they head up Bitchapave Hill once again to the top of Nissan Skyline. A dab of the brakes. dropping down into the right-hander. Brock using the wide line, coming out onto the back straightaway. Co-driver for Peter Brock today was co-driver at Le Mans, Larry Perkins, and he'll be taking over at the halfway mark of this event, just studying the form and following Brock as he pursues the lead away.
Pass, you get out of the way. But over the top and into the Dunlop loop they go. Richards contending with another slower car, and Brock, they both get past quite safely as they head into Mazda.
Richards in 31. The short run downhill to the left-hander in the Scholastic 300 at Amaroo Park. Brock with the headlights blazing. Richards would be more than aware that he's got Peter Brock on his tail and is going to put a lot of pressure on him. They come out of the bottom turn through the lake corner, the short run up to Wonderlick corner. The right-hander, Brock, is getting close as they come across the line past their pit boards now. Brock with his crew giving him signals. He heads off up the hill after Jim Richards. But this man is not your average race car driver when it comes to racing him on a wet surface. Into Dunlop Loop. Brock just as close as he has been for the last couple of laps. Richards and Brock have started to pull away from Gary Scott in the Nissan Turbo. Dow Corning presenting the Scholastic 300 from Amaroo Park Raceway. We'll return shortly with more of the action. And welcome back to Amaroo Park Raceway. The Castrol scoreboard shows you exactly how they're running on the course. 31, Jimmy Richards in the BMW up front and leading. 05, Peter Brock for the dealer team. Car number 35 is Ron Gillard in the Mazda RX-7. 16, of course, is Gary Scott of Queensland in the Nissan Turbo. And then car number 4 is Terry Finnegan in the Repco Spares Commodore. That's updating after 17 of 155 laps on our Castrol scoreboard.
Jim Richards, car 31 we're watching, and he's coming up on the tail of the Gibson Nissan Exit Turbo.
It's Christine Gibson, and she, of course, being a very obliging driver and a professional, moves out of way to give Richards the run of the race down to the lake corner. The seesaw battle continuing between Richards and Peter Brock. You see Brock will make a run at Richards, get right on the tail, but Richards is using the wet part of the course, 56.9 the time. They're about 4 seconds or so off the pace. And if anything, the track seems to be dry just up at that top part of the hill on the top of Bitchapave Hill, but on the back part of the course, that's not to be. But with Gary Scott dropping back one position, there's Frank Gardner. I would think he would be delighted at this stage of the event to see his man up front and leading. They finished strongly in practically all of the Touring Car Championship races this season, and I think a win is long overdue for Jim Richards.
As we watch him again, down into the lake corner, and again, Jim Richards and Peter Brock are catching up on a slower car. But I think Peter Brock's drifted back a little too far, in fact, to make the most of any action that might happen as they pass this slower vehicle.
Well, Brock, like Jim Richards and Gary Scott, realised this is a 155 lap event. It's not a sprint. Most of their time is being consumed at the moment of just settling down to a fair race average. And of course we have pit stops to come during the running of this event. In the pit area is Dick Johnson. Down to you, Dick.
Thanks, Mike. With me I have Frank Gardner, who is the team manager for the JPS BMW, who's actually leading the race. Frank, how do you see yourself running at the moment? It's a plan, or is there something else that you would rather be further in front?
If I could control the weather, Dick, I'd be running to a plan. Unfortunately, I'm not controlling it, so there is no plan. You just keep looking to see how the conditions are going to alter and what to do for tyres, because we certainly won't stay out there too long on the stuff we're on. But we have to be on it for car safety, if nothing else. But there's no plan at the moment, believe you me.
Thank you very much, Frank. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Dick. Well, it's a case of run as hard as you can at the moment for Jim Richards and try and find the wet part of the course so as not to buzz off those intermediate tyres. Peter Brock, quite prepared to sit there. White tyres on the inside, white wheels, I should say, red wheels on the outside. Brock coming down through Mazda corner.
One thing for certain on a day like today when conditions are fairly changeable and there are maybe 1 or 2 more pit stops than you're anticipating, the pit crew work is going to be oh so vital, and it's Peter Brock's crew. You can be guaranteed that they'll get his car back onto the track very smartly once he comes in. I'm sure that's going to be the case too for Jim Richards, who leads Peter Brock at this stage as they go past the pits once more. They won't be calling in just at this stage, but if the track dries out, these intermediate tyres are going to be not much use to them much longer. Over the top and down towards the Dunlop loop they go. Jim Richards, our leader from Peter Brock.
Well, regular competition here at Amaroo Park is always a plus for any driver by the time this annual Endurance Classic comes around. Jim Richards must be given a strong chance in today's field, despite the fact he's running up front at the moment. He's driven in all rounds of the Better Break Series, and unlike a few others, he doesn't mind Amaroo's layout at all.
We came here this season to every one of the Better Breaks rounds, and each time we came, we did go a bit better. And most of our testing is done around this circuit, so yes, it is definitely an advantage.
What about in different weather conditions?
Yes, the same applies. I think we've had about 1 wet meeting here, which it isn't as critical as being at dry meetings, because in the rain, of course, you really only got one thing to compensate for, and that's the wet track.
On what part of the circuit, though, can you make the best use of that advantage?
Well, the best part of the circuit is probably over the top of the hill and down through the right-hander, where most of the time would be made. And we changed those things to springs and shock absorber settings, sway bar settings, to try and sort of get round the turn a bit faster.
Look, that deals with the machinery. What about the drivers? Where do you think you can have the advantage over them?
I don't know whether we'll have that much of an advantage. The only advantage we may have is the fact that we race here a bit more than most of them, so perhaps we may have a fraction of an advantage in that respect, but I think it'll be very close.
The thoughts of Jim Richards before the event, and they're certainly falling into place at the moment as with almost 23 laps completed of the Scholastic 300, the former Kiwi will lead the field across the line. Second spot being held down by Peter Brock in the 05 Commodore. Third place by Ron Gillard in the Mazda RX-7. Then back to car 16 Gary Scott in 4th place. There's Brock going through in 05, still holding down in 2nd spot. Let's go back to the pits and to Dick Johnson.
Thanks, Mike. I'm with Larry Perkins, who's the team manager, co-driver of the 05 Holden Dealer Team Commodore. I was just going to ask Larry, what do you think as far as the tyres situation?
Okay, just a slight loss of communication there down in the pit area as this scrap continues into the right-hander. Brock a little bit closer this time. You see they're starting to wear a pattern into the dry. There's a dry strip there along that straight, and the groove to the outside heading up the hill is also dry. Richards pegging back to the inside, a little wet there, but still holding his station over Peter Brock. Still with the wipers going, keeping the screen clear as they drop down into the right-hander.
Yes, there's not enough moisture on the track to really create too much problems for people behind the front runner. Vision's pretty good, and as we say, the track is starting to dry out fairly nicely.
Jim Richards in the JPS BMW leads Peter Brock as the Scholastic 300 continues at Amaroo Park. Welcome back to Amaroo Park as Terry Finnegan on the inside takes Peter Brock for 2nd place and now sets off after Jim Richards. Finnegan has been turning terrific times in the wet and has now taken Brock, moves in on Jim Richards as they come down to the left-hander at Honda. Here he comes. Richards been able to hold his place on the racetrack, but Finnegan has found a new lease on life. The Repco Commodore down on the inside. Richards through the gears. He'll make Terry Finnegan earn every part of his pass if he can affect it. Once again through Wonderlick corner, back across the line, and it is still Jim Richards, but making the moves, Terry Finnegan. As they head up the hill again, Brock still back in third, so the BMW leads 2 Commodores at this stage of the event. Then Gary Scott back in 4th place. But here is Finnegan just on the inside. A dab of the brakes from Richards, and then on the inside, Terry Finnegan of Sydney goes through to take the lead in the Scholastic 300. Great driving here on the part of the Sydney driver.
Oh, yes, indeed. I think that Jim Richards must have been surprised that Finnegan arrived so suddenly, because it looked must have looked to Richards and Brock as it did to us that it was a race in 2. But suddenly Terry Finnegan moved up, and he's our new leader as we follow him into the late corner.
The lap score chart will show that he was sitting back off the pace originally and biding his time, and then all of a sudden after 22 laps it was Terry Finnegan who just stormed up on behind Peter Brock. Keeping in mind Finnegan last year was able to run the longest before a pit stop. He's a local track expert who knows this course, set his car up for it, and I think it would be a just reward for Terry Finnegan if he can stay up there through to the finish of the event. Privateer obviously has got strong sponsorship backing this season from Repco, but he's out in front and leading the Scholastic 300 as we enter lap number 29 during the running of the 155 lap Enduro that is seen by many people as the first of the curtain races to the James Hardy 1000, but of course you see exclusively on the 7 network. Peter Brock. Terry Finnegan leads once again up the straight, starting to open that gap. Meanwhile, this great scrap, and Peter Brock going through on the inside will get 2nd place across the strike and set out on the charge after Terry Finnegan. I would tend to think that Finnegan may have started the race. There's the scrap continuing. Brock has finally got through on the inside, just at the top of the hill then. That drops Jim Richards back into 3rd place. Gary Scott, I would think, would be pretty close to the action in 4th place. They were then followed by the first of the RX-7s being Ron Gillard.
These early dices for the lead, 1st, 2nd and 3rd, of course, as the track dries out, are going to play havoc with tyre wear. It's going to be interesting.
There's Brock going through. Back behind Brock is Richards, of course, as we will show you in the run up the next straightaway, and Gary Scott you'll see come into picture shortly. There's Richards, and here comes Scott, who of course, as we mentioned to you, was running on slick tyres, and then all of a sudden as the track has started to dry out, in the last 5 laps, you've been able to see Terry Finnegan come from the clouds, past Peter Brock, past Jim Richards, and now it's Gary Scott's turn. He is starting to come into his own as they head up Bitchapave Hill. 31 laps completed of 155 tours of Amaroo Park Raceway in the Scholastic 300. And here is the young Queenslander. You'll have a lot of people at BTQ or watching through Channel 7 in Brisbane riding with him as he takes Richards, now moves up after Peter Brock. So the Queenslander comes back strongly as they complete 31 laps of the Scholastic 300.
Well, an interesting decision by Gary Scott to choose those slick tyres as we look out. It's a very gloomy day still here at Amaroo, and to predict that it was going to dry out, well, it's a very brave decision indeed. Of course, we may still get rain. There's plenty of time left in this race and a lot of laps to cover, but let's get back to the action there. Well, Peter Brock goes through, then Scott.
Well, it's only taken, I think it took about 23 laps to dry the circuit. You can see now the dry lane around the course starting to come into play. And as soon as the track has dried out, Richards has gone off the boil. He'll be looking at a pit stop very quickly because he'll be overcooking the tyres. There is Scott, who has given them, at one stage, must have been 200 metres behind the top running 4 drivers. Now he's been able to come back. And I think very shortly we're going to see Gary Scott putting some pressure on the race leader. Let's go trackside to Dick Johnson to bring us up to date with what's happening in the pits.
Thanks, Mike. So far we've only had 2 retirements. Both the cars, the Gary Wilmington Magic 11 Falcon and also the Easy Pav Mazda RX-7, which obviously had pavlova in the gearbox instead of oil because he had problems with the gearbox too. But it's interesting to note now that the line is drying on the track and there is a very narrow groove out there, and the cars with slick tyres are now coming through to the front to lead the race. Everyone thought for a moment there Terry Finnegan had been lapped, but in actual fact he is in the lead in the race, and Gary Scott is now making a charge from about 4th place.
Well, Dick, it'd be fair to assume that the way he came through the field after 23 laps that Terry Finnegan had made the right choice with slick tyres.
He certainly did. I've been speaking to his team manager, and they have the hardest compound tyres they can possibly find. Well, and the reason for this is the fact that it takes a long time for the tyres to generate enough heat to be able to stick to the road.
Well, I think it was Finnegan last year who was able to run longer out on the racetrack. Everyone thought he was weaning canvas to run on.
Well, the canvas seems to be the predominant thing around this type of circuit. It is a very hard circuit on tyres, and I think the bigger cars will be blessed with the amount of wet that they've had this morning to enable their tyres to stay cool during the 60 or 70 laps that they have to do.
How long would you say that Jim Richards can stay out there running on intermediates before he overcooks?
Well, as I speak to you, I can see him going up the hill now, and his car is starting to get a little bit wavy in the tail end. So I would say within the next 10 or 15 laps, Jim will be in the pits for tyres, and Brock possibly too before the actual half distance in the race.
OK, thanks very much. That report coming from our pits and Dick Johnson. There's Terry Finnegan, the Repco Accessories Commodore V8 running down to the right-hander at the lake. So a privateer leads the Scholastic 300, the opening round of the Endurance Championship. Brock in 2nd spot, but look at the young Queenslander. Gary Scott in 3rd here behind Brock. And here they come out of the corner, the crowd on its feet as the Scholastic 300 continues on 7's big day of sport. Let's go back to Sports Centre and to Terry Willett. Welcome back to Amaroo Park Raceway as we update you on the Castrol scoreboard. And the race leader is Terry Finnegan in car number 4. 2nd spot, Gary Scott on the road. 3rd is 05 Brock. 4th is Richards, just gone into the pit area and will be crossing down shortly to Dick Johnson. Well, Dick, they stayed out perhaps a few laps longer than we anticipated.
Yes, Mike. Actually, Frank Garter is now putting some 021 compound slicks on the motor car, which hopes will take him right through to the end of the race. And I reckon if it rains again, we'll probably see Jim back in the pits.
Yes, it's a sort of a potpourri, although the track has dried out. That light rain that was falling earlier now seems to have subsided somewhat. A reasonably well organised and well orchestrated pit stop for Jim Richards, Dick.
Not too bad, 42.46 seconds, Mike, but they did have a little trouble with the left-hand rear wheel.
Well, for the race itself, how many laps would you see maybe Peter Brock and the front runners and Terry Finnegan staying out there?
I would doubt if you would see Peter Brock stay out there any longer than about another 10 laps at the very outside, because by the look of the tyres that came off Jim's car, they're very, very scuffed and very scrubbed. So I'd say Peter's probably been driving a little bit more cautiously on a car that probably handles a little better. But I'd say with the dry track the way it is, he'll be in very shortly.
Well, the gap between Terry Finnegan out in front and, of course, Gary Scott running 2nd is about the same, although maybe Finnegan's tyres would obviously go off a little earlier with the way he was throwing the car around.
Yes, but Terry Finnegan is on very, very hard slick, so I would expect him to probably go 70-odd laps.
Makes for an interesting race. Do you wish you were out there?
Actually, I would have probably started the race on slicks, but at the moment we're moving down to see Peter Brock, who is about ready to come in, I believe.
OK, Dick, we'll leave you back in the pit area. Thanks for your reports. Jim Richards trying to warm up those already scuffed tyres to get back on the pace and go chase the leaders. Terry Finnegan, though, is still the race leader in the Repco Accessories Commodore. Gary Scott in 2nd place on the road, and the gap between our race leader and 2nd spot is about the same. Lap 44 of 155 completed in the Scholastic 300, being presented by Dow Corning here at Amaroo Park Raceway this afternoon. And there's Richards going through into the left-hander.
That's one way to warm up your tyres, I suppose, Mike.
Well, he has to get them hot quickly. Now he's got to go back and drive on the line that they've been able to wear into the circuit. The same line that is being used, obviously, by those running on the slicks. Here's Peter Brock coming into the pit area, and Dick Johnson is there to describe and to time exactly what happens.
Thanks, Mike. Well, they're taking their intermediate tyres off, and they're putting on a very hard compound Yokohama tyre. The left-hand rear wheel is off, and they're actually scuffed around pretty well, and these are the non-working side tyres. So I'd expect actually a time of around about 30-odd seconds. It's now 23, 24 seconds, and they're just about, they're away, and there's a stop of 26.49 seconds.
Well, that was a good one for Peter Brock, and he's out running again in 0.5, and he hasn't lost too much on the racetrack. Scott will pick him up on the way up the hill, but Scott, keeping in mind, will probably stay out there just a few laps longer. There's Brock going over the top and dropping down into the Dunlop loop. Terry Finnegan, meanwhile, continues to circulate at the head of the field. Brock will now try to warm these up as quickly as possible. The Steve Masterton, of course, carrying our race cam, got off the line quickly, but ran into a few problems. How's the race going for you, Steve?
I can't quite hear what you're saying, but
that's a...
I'll fill you in with what's happening.
OK, do that. Take it away, Steve. What was the problem early in the race?
I understand on the left down, the road is very slippery and dangerous, and this is where it requires a lot of experience. I've got my tyres up to racing temperature now, and they're sticking to the road like they're supposed to, but they take a hell of a lot of warming up. This is where the likes of Brock and Moffat and those guys excel themselves in the early stages of a wet race. They know just how to warm the tyres up quickly, and boy, until you do that, it's pretty dangerous.
Well, you still have those beads.
Just exiting the loop now. Third gear here. A little bit of understeer in the car. Pulling about 100 miles an hour here now. On the brakes slightly. Whoops. Whoa. Whoa. 114 miles an hour here in third gear. Down into the lake. Third gear and onto the main straight. Whoa! Over.
OK, over and out. Steve Masterton, beads of rain still continue to fall across the windscreen. There are still many questions to be answered in the Scholastic 300 when we return to Amaroo Park. At the Scholastic 300 from Sydney's Amaroo Park Raceway in the Four Seasons too. There's our race leader, Terry Finnegan, in car number 4. Jim Richards was heading back into the pit area for another quick stop. Dick Johnson, problems for the JPS BMW team.
Yes, Mike, the JPS BMW team, after running so well early in the race, have unfortunately broken a half shaft or a stub axle in the rear end, so they've got plenty of problems and have retired the car from the race. And we've also seen the little Nissan Exa of Christine Gibson come in. She made a very, very fast pit stop and is back out on the road again.
Thank you, Dick. There's our race leader, Terry Finnegan. Second spot on the racetrack is, of course, the Queenslander Gary Scott, Ron Gillard in the Mazda RX-7 in third, Peter McLeod in an RX-7 in fourth, and then back into fifth place would be car number 8, which is the Ron Harrop Andrew Harris entry. Was to have been driven by Warren Cullen, but Warren stepped out of the car just prior to the start, feeling ill, and has given the run to those two drivers.
I think Dick Johnson's going to be a busy man today, Mike, because as we speak, a little more rain falling, and we think there's a little bit more on the way towards Amaroo Park. So these people are going to have to consider just what sort of tyres they want to run. They're going to have to keep a constant monitor on just how their tyres are performing, and I guess lap times are going to tell them that. The leaders are circulating in times around about 4 seconds above what they were doing in practice yesterday. Gary Scott set a time of 52.2. Well, we're watching them go around in about 56.5 seconds, so That just shows you how carefully they're having to take it, because again the rain is starting to fall. Not long after the cars had just about managed to dry out a strip around the track, and they were starting to get a little bit quicker.
There's Tony Mulvihill in the pit area. Seems to be a lengthy stop, Dick Johnson.
Yes, Mike, and the problem they have is probably one that you might face, because they're trying to get one guy who is about 4 times the size of the driver that was in the car out of it. And like they've already been there for 1 minute and 14 seconds.
Thank you, Dick. And for that, I won't drive with you at Bathurst. Tony Mulvihill for a driver change with Brian Nightingale. They qualified 16th on the grid, 54.8, 2.3 seconds behind pole sitter Gary Scott. So they've gone out to rejoin the race. There's our race leader, though, Terry Finnegan, and the Repco Accessories number 4 Commodore down to the left-hander. Heading down towards the late corner again. That gap, which we'll give you shortly, between our race leader Finnegan and Gary Scott.
As Finnegan moves up on the tail of John Bundy in that RX-7, he's not having too many problems getting past. Bundy lets him by, and Finnegan goes past the strip once more. It's the start line up the hill, and doing it fairly comfortably. And you can see still the wipers working. There's no one in front of him, so that tells you that there's still a bit of rain tumbling out of these skies above Amaroo Park. Perhaps we should call it Umbrella Park today. Certainly the crowd here, a good crowd too, considering the conditions. They've got their umbrellas out. It's really no more than a drizzle, but it's enough to affect this track.
Well, they're enjoying an intriguing race, because Terry Finnegan threatened so much here last year. There's a section of the crowd, the sturdy motor racers who turn out at the ARDC's Amaroo Park Raceway, one of Australia's most professionally promoted racetracks. Down to the right-hander, they're seeing Terry Finnegan. There's a lot of people here barracking for the local today. A fellow who knows this circuit extremely well. Drives all the rounds of the Better Brakes AMSCAR series here. Has been a front runner in that division. Now, Peter Brock, we've seen, has already made his pit stop. Gary Scott was just ahead of him on the road when they came back out. But there you can see Brock has been able to fight his way past Gary Scott. Scott's still running in second. Brock trying to come back through the pack after dropping almost a lap during that pit stop, or just under a lap. Now here's Scott moving to the inside of him as they head up the hill, and he will take that back. Still retaining his second spot. Heading up to the top of Nissan Skyline, dropping down over the loop, and the windscreen wipers start again. And that nice dry patch of road that we were watching early has started to have water all over it again. Now the fellows who have been out there running on the slick tyres, you can notice, are backing off the pace. The only one that doesn't at this stage appears to be Terry Finnegan. And Finnegan shortly will be coming up towards Wonderlick Corner to put a lap on Peter McLeod. There's Gary Scott, still running comfortably in second spot on the road. And third spot, of course, being held down by the driver of car 35, Ron Gillard, the Mazda RX-7. So we had a race that started in the wet, it went dry, and it's gone back to the wet again. And Brock, you can see, tail out. Not really what he wanted, because he was making great inroads on the leaders as soon as the track dried out. It's really not wet enough to want to go in and start fiddling around with intermediate tyres again, so you really have to just hold station and try and run as quickly as you can and hope that the track is in fact going to dry out again.
Well, the lad from Victoria must be muttering under his breath comments about how Sydney people abuse Melbourne weather. Well, I'm sure he's not too happy about what's happening here at Amaroo Park. As soon as he changes tyres to suit the conditions, then it starts to rain again. But he's just got to make the most of it for the moment and hope that the rain goes away again and the cars dry out an area of the track that will suit his tyres.
We're following Peter Brock. There's Gary Scott just ahead of him. Well, Dick Johnson, as I said before, this is the race of the 4 seasons. Those guys have gone out and changed over onto slicks. They're facing this period of time where they've just got to sit there and wait and hope that it dries out again.
It certainly is, Mike, and it's very unfortunate for those that already have visited the pits, because I probably predict that the guys that are sitting in the box seat would be Terry Finnegan and Gary Scott, because as yet they have yet to pit. And Steve Masterton is also hanging in there. He's on a set of intermediate type tyres, but very hard intermediates, and they plan to run somewhere around about 90 laps before they stop. So these guys, with the a little bit further into the race will have the choice to run the last few laps on the correct sort of tyres.
Okay, thanks, Dick Johnson. Peter Brock still trying to come back through the field after a very, very quick pit stop, but Terry Finnegan continues to lead the Scholastic 300 from Amaroo Park Raceway. To the Scholastic 300 on the 7 network. We're into lap number 60, and the race leader from Sydney is Terry Finnegan in the Repco Accessories Commodore V8, and he is doing it comfortably.
He certainly is. He's the local driver. He's a very likeable man, and because he's in front, I guess he's got the strongest chance in his Repco Commodore. However, Terry's usual flawless preparation has come a little bit unstuck this week. It's really been one problem after another.
We've had a week of sheer pandemonium as far as preparing the car is concerned. We've had a cracked crankshaft, broken fuel pump, gearbox has been shot. We've had so many problems, it just hasn't been funny. It's very hard preparing a car for a long distance race. It's quite easy actually going to the sprint races because you know, you've only got to do about 35, 40 laps all weekend. But this week it's been very hard on us.
Last year in this race you ran further than anyone else on one set of tyres. What are your plans for this afternoon?
We'll probably run the same schedule as we did last year. We were able to run a long way because we staggered our compounds on the car, and that allowed us to run harder tyres on the outside. This year we'll try the same, but I may not go quite as far as I did last year.
Well, I don't know what he means by not as far. That was a rather dejected Terry Finnegan, obviously after practice in a woeful week of everything going wrong and blowing up. That's all come together for him here at Amaroo Park today in the wet as well, because he continues to lead the Scholastic 300 here. In second spot, Gary Scott, still doing it quite comfortably. Car number 50, Peter McLeod, coming back up through the field gradually, and then Ron Harrop in car number 8. Heading up the Betchapave Hill again with Finnegan in car number 4. As Dick Johnson had mentioned, he's got the hardest set of tyres on imaginable, and it's going to work well for him at this stage. Scott is going to be in the same situation, running on slicks, not being able to make up ground. In fact, I think if anything, Finnegan has been able to increase his lead at the head of the pack.
And I think one man he's not going to have too many problems with is Peter Brock. He's apparently got a fair bit of trouble at the moment. I understand he's in the pits and not too happy.
Dick Johnson, if you're with us, the problems with Peter Brock.
Yes, Mike, they had the intermediate tyres ready again to put onto the car because the track was getting so wet again. But unfortunately, he got into a situation coming into the pits where he hit a puddle of water, and it looks as though he speared himself into the fence on the entry to the pits.
Well, problems continuing for Peter Brock. Finnegan at this stage, though, Dick seems to be able to hold his position. He hasn't, we haven't noticed anyone, in particular Gary Scott, being able to gain the ground on him, although he's waltzing around out there a little bit. They head down to Mazda Corner, and Terry Finnegan in car number 4, as you can see, just a tip sideways coming out of there. Back to Dick Johnson.
Thanks, Mike. We got Steve Marston in the pits now, and it appears as though he has some sort of a problem with the gearbox. What's the problem, Steve?
It's making a hell of a row in third and second gear. If I put it into top gear and it hammers hell out of the floor, I don't know what's going on under there, but I think it'd be stupid to keep the car out there and blow it to pieces.
Okay, we've got a problem down here in the bottom corner, as you can see, with our race leader going into the wall and brushing the wall down there. That's Terry Finnegan in car number 4. Big problems with Gary Scott ready to come past him. Here is Finnegan trying to turn the car around. Scott has just gone past him to take over the lead for the race. Don't know what sort of damage there is there on the car. Well, obviously he slid around and caught the wall. Now, whether or not he's going to go to the pits or continue in the race, Gary Scott, meanwhile, has gone through to take over the lead in the Scholastic 300. And an excursion there for Terry Finnegan has dropped him back to second, but at least he's still running. A little of the coach work is missing, but here's Gary Scott, still running on slicks on a very, very wet track indeed at Amaroo Park. But in a race of changing fortunes, the young Queenslander in 16, the Nissan Turbo, beautifully prepared, has now gone through to take the lead. Whether Finnegan can come back, only time will tell.
Well, it speaks volumes for his driving ability when he can go to the front in this race, when really, I suppose, 2/3 of the laps completed so far have been done in fairly wet conditions, and he's carrying slick tyres. But then again, there's been a fairly high attrition rate in the early stages of the race. There's the Peter Brock car, and oh dear, he certainly did come to grief. That front end looking very sad.
That has happened, obviously, as Dick Johnson has mentioned, on the entrance where they go from behind the Armco, even before they make it into the pit. So he's had a moment there on the approach road, and that is not what Larry Perkins wants to look at. And I don't think Peter Brock would be too happy about it either. Well, obviously, Dick Johnson will be talking to Peter Brock a little later, and we'll get the full story on it. But happening on the approach to the pit entrance, and after the rotten luck, as Larry looks at it thinking, well, it was
he was once in a car at Le Mans like that.
That was it. It was the shoe was on the other foot at Le Mans, where Larry, of course, was running and had a moment and felt very badly about it indeed. But now it looks as though the 05 car requires a lot of work before the next round of the Endurance Championship. Gary Scott is the race leader in car number 16, coming through the short straight up to Wunderlich Corner. And rain very, very heavy indeed at this time as they come across the strike. And we'll get the gap back to Terry Finnegan in car number 4. Scott going through. Finnegan hasn't given up.
I don't think that damage could have been too substantial. He'd have been in the pits by now if that little altercation he had with the lakeside corner caused him, with the lake corner I should say, caused him many problems. So Scott continues to lead, but Finnegan will be chasing him.
Well, I don't think Finnegan is that far behind Gary Scott, because Scott has had to ease off the pace appreciably. We'll try and give you the split as they come down. There's the number 8 Harris and Harrop entry. And then coming down the back part of the course will be, of course, Terry Finnegan in car number 4. So Finnegan is only, I would think, as we pick up on the Sepulsa heading up the straight with some big problems. Christine Gibson at the wheel, having had a problem there, is going to go behind the pit wall. Yes, she is. There's Terry Finnegan. Keeping in mind, he led the race. He had a lose down in the bottom corner. Gary Scott went through to lead the race, but Finnegan, not to be denied, is coming again and closing dramatically on Gary Scott. Correct, Dick Johnson?
Thanks, Mike. We have a changing fortunes in this race. It is one of those types of days where anything can happen, and anything is happening. As you can see with Peter Brock's car, the damage is not too great really when you consider the fact that it's only broken a wheel and torn off a steering arm. But that puts him out of the race. Christine Gibson has just slid into the fence coming onto the main straight and is back on the road again. But whether she sustained any damage as yet, we do not know. But Terry Finnegan is one guy who is really going to have to play his cards right here and get the car into the pits at the right time and definitely make the right choice of tyres, as too is Gary Scott. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Dick, for that report, being on the spot down there. There is Terry Finnegan, headlights on in car number 4. Just ahead of him on the road, going up the hill, is Gary Scott. And I think Scott has almost put a lap on Peter McLeod at this stage, so anything can happen in the final stages of this race. We're in lap number 68 of 155 circuits in the Scholastic 300. And there is the race leader, Terry Finnegan, treating it gingerly through the Dunlop loop.
Both his headlights are working, but you can see that's a little bit of the damage that he's done to the rear end. His parking lights and brake lights not working on the right-hand side.
Well, if the track dries out just a little, it means that the pace will be able to be picked up by both Gary Scott and by Terry Finnegan. But there he is, Sydney's Terry Finnegan, in pursuit of Gary Scott in the Scholastic 300 from Sydney's Amaroo Park.
To Amaroo Park, and that's a sad story for Terry Finnegan. Into that troublesome lake corner again, and he looks like, well, he's out of the race for at least the moment. He's out of the car, and
well, that happened just as we came out of our break with Terry Finnegan, who was coming down, and here it is, down into the right-hander at the lake, and it steers straight off crunch, and that is concrete wall. An exit, Terry Finnegan from the Scholastic 300. Bad luck indeed.
There's our race leader, Gary Scott. Thanks very much to Terry Finnegan. And Finnegan with more problems than a one-arm paper hanger at the moment. In fact, he's right out of it. So Gary Scott says thanks very much and proceeds on with the lead.
Well, Dick Johnson obviously is keeping up with this. Terry Finnegan, he's still got a grin anyway, a smile. He's got a lot of supporters down there giving him a slap on the back and saying well done, because he was in there with a very, very big chance of the lead. The car, though, has been left parked there against the wall. That has put Gary Scott. And I think he'll need a few more Repco accessories to get that straight for the second round of the Endurance Championship in a fortnight's time. But bad luck indeed for Terry Finnegan. But going back to look comfortable, there's Gary Scott in car number 16. As we head once again up the hill. There's Scott.
We follow him up the hill once more, and at least one problem they won't have at the top of the hill is the problem that they had last time late in the day when the sun was setting. It was right in the driver's eyes, but of course with overcast conditions today they're not going to have that problem, but they've got plenty of others to contend with as you watch Gary Scott take it into the Mazda corner as he nurses the car around this very tricky, very tight but very slippery circuit today. Down into Honda corner we watch Gary Scott, windscreen wipers going of course.
We're following Gary Scott in car 16, but while that Finnegan incident occurred, Dick Johnson, correct me if I'm wrong, was Gary Scott in the pits there?
Yes, he was, Mike. He's been in, he's put intermediate tyres on, which I reckon would have to be the way to go for the rest of the race. And providing the conditions don't change, I would say Gary Scott is now in the box seat and controlling the race well. We've even had a situation where Ron Gillard put himself into the fence and they have repaired the left-hand front of the car and gone out again. Christine Gibson has also retired the Pulsar from the race for reasons unknown to me. But I would say Gary is looking good, and it's very unfortunate for Terry Finnegan, but I'd say the choice of staying out there was a little bit too long on those particular tyres.
Thanks very much, Dick Johnson. Well, with a quick pit stop by Gary Scott in 16, changing up to intermediate tyres. Coming from what was almost a lap down is Ron Harrop in car number 8. This was the car that was to have been driven, of course, by Warren Cullen. Andrew Harris, the co-driver today. And here it is coming onto the straight. Looks like Giesler's car. Was it alongside, a little sideways? So he has been able to take advantage of the pit stop carried out by Gary Scott and will go and has gone through now to take over the lead. Scott is still second on the road in car number 16. And at the moment, car number 30, Tony Cabbage in third place and Peter McLeod in fourth.
Harrop in 8 and Tony Cabbage in 30 are two cars which haven't pitted yet. So that's why they're doing so well. So I wonder how long it'll be before they visit their friends in the pit.
Well, it's a nice feeling to be up there and leading the race. The conditions wouldn't be good to revel in. But Ron Harrop, the driver with Andrew Harris today. Warren Cullen sitting out the event, not feeling all that well. As we mentioned, part of a two-car team that will be going to the James Hardy 1000 at Mount Panorama at Bathurst at the end of September. And joining the team for that race will, of course, be Australia's former Formula One world champion, Alan Jones. At the moment, they're enjoying their run at the head of the pack here at Amaroo Park with Gary Scott in second place and Tony Cabbage in the Mazda RX-7 running in third, but two of those still to pit. With 74 laps in of 155 tours at Amaroo Park Raceway in the Scholastic 300, which is the first round of the Endurance Championship. Second round, of course, will be held at Oran Park in a fortnight, when Peter Brock and some of the other challengers will be back to split the points. But we've still got fair way to go in this race. 75 of 155 now confirmed as the race leader. Ron Harrop heads down to the left-hander at Honda corner, taking it very, very gingerly. About 200 metres, I would think, back behind him would be Gary Scott. So Scott is still on the boil. And keeping in mind he is already on intermediate tyres, so you can expect to see him haul in the race leader at the moment, car number 8, Ron Harrop.
Yes, Scott, a man possessed of great driving skills that he kept so close to the lead on those slicks is a reflection of that. And now that he's got the right tyres on, Ron Harrop in car 8, the Commodore had better keep a consistent watch on his rear vision mirror. This is the corner that caused Finnegan the problems. He's been cleared away from there. It's a fairly solid wall, though. It's made of cement. Don't get too much give from a cement wall. And Finnegan did substantial front-end damage right at that corner you're looking at now. That's about where he came to grief, on that Park Raceway sign, Amaroo Park Raceway sign. He's gouged a few inches of concrete out, but it's certainly the car that came off second best.
Well, earlier, of course, he got into the tyre wall down there. That didn't do as much damage as meeting the concrete wall side on, let me tell you. But the car is out of harm's way. The Cullen Harrop entry, once again, coming on the front straight. Looks like Mike Bergman, not that far back behind in the Mazda RX-7. Mike Bergman, a regular here at Amaroo Park Raceway. His co-driver for the event is Bob Stevens. Still looking very, very straight with no excursions. On the same trim that it started the race. Can't say that about a few of the other entrants, though.
Not so straight as that radiator grille. It's a little bit wobbly, but that's not going to cause him any problems. And we're certainly not likely to overheat today.
Well, the biggest problem that I think that Harrop is going to face is a little fella from Queensland with a Nissan Turbo on the boil with intermediate tyres. Going down towards the lake corner again, Mike Bergman still sitting in there with the Mazda RX-7 behind Ron Harrop. As they come out of the corner and along the short straight to Wonderlick Corner, the right-hander. This is where he has to treat it very, very gingerly indeed. Oh, slower car, awfuled right at the last moment. Harrop didn't need that, and Bergman clings to his tail again as they come up the hill. Bergman's car is the RX-7 that was driven here last year by Bob Stevens and Ron Dixon. There's Harrop going through Dunlop Loop, now working down towards Mazda Corner. We're keeping the split time between our race leader and our Queensland second place man, Gary Scott. And it's closing all the time, coming down to the left-hander at Honda Corner.
There's Mike Bergman, right on Harrop's tail. I'm sure Harrop feels he doesn't need this right at the moment because, in fact, as they come down to the lake corner, through goes Mike Bergman.
Yes, he's trying to pull back a lap on the leader. And the RX-7 running very, very reliably.
Just as well they'd removed Terry Finnegan's car from that corner, or we could have had another one coming to grief because they took it fairly wide between them there. Mike Bergman takes it over the top through Skyline again and heads for the Dunlop Loop.
78 laps completed of 155 circuits at Amaroo Park in the Scholastic 300 presented by Dow Corning, with number 8 still out there and leading. Scott closing, though. We expect to see Ron Harrop heading to the pit area very, very shortly, obviously for a change of tyres. Bergman Stevens entry, car number 33, continues to go down towards the lake corner on the right-hander. Gary Scott starting to get on terms, not far behind this particular car, number 33. Looking for number 8. And I think 8 may be heading to the pit area. Dick Johnson will be able to fill us in on all the action as Gary Scott will come across the strike and, in fact, should go through to take over the lead as the race leader comes into the pits. Take it away. Dick Johnson.
Thanks, Mike. Ron Harrop is now in the pits. He's taking what he's had with intermediate tyres off and putting intermediate tyres back on. Andrew Harris is going to get into the car, and boy, I don't envy the job that poor guy's got. Getting into a car that he is running out in the wet weather on new tyres, which is not much fun. But also we have many other things that are happening down here at the moment. As you can see, there's cars going sideways through the corner coming onto pit straight, which makes it very, very difficult for some of the people standing in the pits here to sort of cop the rubber in the eyes and things like that. The pit stop here is just about finished. They're just getting the front wheel on, and I reckon they'll be out again. So, Mike, I'd say Gary Scott at the moment, I don't think would have to stop again, so he's looking pretty good.
Well, the change to intermediate tyres has certainly worked for Gary Scott. Ron Harrop steps from the car. Andrew Harris is in, and the Scholastic 300 continues at Amaroo Park. We're following at the moment Gary Scott, the race leader, on lap number 82 in car number 16, leading the field. You might recall last year his co-driver George Fury went solo in this event to give Nissan a breakthrough in the endurance races. It was seen as a lucky omen, although he's having some problems there, clipping the rib coming off that corner. Fury went on to win the 1983 Scholastic 300, and Scott looking good at this stage for a repeat win for 84.
Yes, Amaroo Park is well known, though, for being one of the most demanding racetracks in Australia. As Gary Scott would agree, in a race of 300 kilometres, the circuit is just as hard on drivers as it is on cars.
It is a circuit that's definitely harder on cars than drivers. Then it becomes a track that's very hard on drivers if the car stays together. And, you know, 155 laps round here is very demanding. You don't get a chance to rest. The car's always being changed down or up a gear. Always very hard on the brakes. It turns into a very, very hard test of man and machinery, and it's quite a test at the end of the day. We've been here all year and have been a consistent front row act, and I think, you know, with the development the boys have done, we have a brilliant little car that suits here very well. I think we're in a very strong position to go well all day, and I think that's the secret of success here. As you know, last year George Fury drove the whole way himself. He hung back a little bit at the beginning and just mowed them over and went off into the distance. And I think we're looking for that sort of race plan. But in motor racing, you're never sure what's going to happen, so we'll just have to play it all by ear. I've got a bit of competition from my old sparring partner Steve Masterton. He's going very well. You can never underestimate him or Peter Brock, and we won't be getting it easy by any means. But we're very confident.
Well, confident he may be. He was certainly confident going into the race, and at this stage the cards seem to be falling into place for Gary Scott. He's had to do it the hard way, though. Coming back through, change of tyres, had to sit back there for so long early in the race on slicks and see those running on intermediate and wet weather tyres run away from him. He's doing this nicely. Second spot now held down by Andrew Harris, and third place by Peter McLeod in car number 50. Then in fourth place in car number 35 is Ron Gillard in the Mazda RX-7. There's Scott heading up Bitchapave Hill once again, car number 16, lap number 85.
The circuit's still pretty wet. The point we made earlier in the afternoon when it wasn't quite as wet was that the amount of moisture being thrown out by the tyres. Well, there you can see, as Gary Scott goes around into the Dunlop loop, that he throws up a fair bit of moisture, especially as he goes through those corners, and anyone who comes up behind him is going to have his vision pretty much impaired by that much moisture. But it's not worrying Gary Scott, because he's the man in front in the Nissan Turbo, car number 16.
Well, the Nissan team, of course, supported Amaroo Park Raceway in the Better Break Series, not only last year, but throughout 1984. And Gary Scott has been their flag waver for the running of the Better Breaks Amscar Series. Had some problems when he first came down to Amaroo with some over-aggressive driving from some of his competitors. Finished around sideways for the first couple of meetings. But great dedication shown by Scott to this particular circuit that some drivers don't favour. but he has stuck to his guns, and I think you're going to find this young Queenslander a very competitive man by the time that the Nissan team go to the James Hardy 1000 at Mount Panorama Bathurst at the end of September. The gap still opening up between Scott and Andrew Harris in the Kmart Commodore car number 8, with Peter McLeod in the Mazda RX-7 still in 3rd place. And then, of course, car number 35, Ron Gillard in the Mazda RX-7 back in 4th spot.
Peter McLeod, of course, started the race on slick tyres. There he is up in 3rd. So it could be that he's popped the intermediates on.
As he's been able to power through there, it's really almost wet weather tyres, having the full set on, but he's gone out. There's Peter McLeod running presently in 3rd place in the race. Peter McLeod, of course, is the defending endurance champion in the Slick 50 Mazda RX-7, comes from Shell Harbour, has been running in the Australian Touring Car Championship, was in there with a good chance out of 2 midway through the season, but he's run all the rounds of it and intends to run, of course, the Endurance Championship rounds leading up to the James Hardy 1000 at Bathurst.
He let the Fred Giesler Commodore slip past him there, and I just wonder if he hasn't got a problem or two, because really he shouldn't have got past from the man in 3rd place, which is Peter McLeod.
Still some activity occurring in the pits, and with his thoughts of the race thus far, it's Dick Johnson.
Thanks, Mike. There are certain elements the drivers have got to put up with in these sort of conditions, and one of the biggest problems is the windscreens fogging up on the inside. And as you can see, there's probably a lot of motor cars with the windscreens that look very white and very opaque. And a guy like the Slick 50 Mazda, Peter McLeod, has also got a better problem than that. He's only got 4th and 5th gear left. So he's been running since lap 10 with only 2 gears in the gearbox, and I suppose that is one reason why everyone looks as though they're past him. Back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Dick. Well, Peter McLeod's number 50 car still 3rd on the road. Gary Scott with a lap up on the field. Andrew Harris in the Kmart Commodore in 2nd place. 9 seconds behind them, of course. In 3rd is Peter McLeod in car number 50.
And Dick Johnson pretty well explained there the problem for Peter McLeod as we watched him go up Bitcher Pave earlier, and the Commodore of Giesler flew past him. I expect McLeod would love to have had 3rd gear, but it just wasn't there. He's only got 4th and 5th.
Come out behind Lusty in the Commodore number 21. It's Graham Lusty doing quite nicely. A couple of laps down, but he's still out there and running. You're watching the Scholastic 300 from Sydney's Amaroo Park Raceway.
The story, after 89 laps of the 155, Gary Scott the leader, and number 8 Harrop is 2nd. Peter McLeod in the Slick 50 Master is 3rd. And we have Ron Gillard and number 30 Tony Cabbage in 5th place. That's pretty slippery out there.
Well, we have 1 Commodore, obviously 1 Nissan Turbo, and 3 Mazdas filling out the positions at the present time. Updating the score, having a look at who's still running up in front with Gary Scott in car number 16, still with a lap over car number 8. Andrew Harris now at the wheel, and then about 5 seconds back to Peter McLeod, and then number 35. Today's Scholastic 300 should see plenty of feverish pit activity later in the race. You can expect a lot more, though, when we get to the James Hardy 1000 at Bathurst, because that's when the international category, Group A, will be seen in Australia for the first time. To look at the new class, let's go to Dick Johnson.
Thanks, Mike. Today, have the last day, we'll see these types of motor cars racing at Amaroo, because next year we go to a different category called Group A. And as from January, these cars will be racing in the Touring Car Championship and the long-distance races later in the year. The cars are a little different in many ways. For example, the exterior appearance of the motor cars is more standard. They have not got flares or any of the other auxiliary parts such as spoilers and air dams on the front. But as from the engine point of view, the engines are also a little more standard. They have less modification. You have to use more standard components. Although in other areas, the modifications are more liberal, such as the suspension. There's more hand-fabricated parts. Most of these cars will run 5-speed manual transmissions and so on. So I thought we would ask some of the competitors what their thoughts were on Group A.
Well, the Europeans have the advantage. They've been running Group A now for 2 years, so you can expect Jaguars, Rovers, BMWs, and even Volvos. But they're going to have to watch the Japanese motor industry. They're very determined to do well in any form of motorsport around the world. And I expect, Dickie, a few American accents from you. Dickie, we'll show you ours when you show us yours.
Obviously, your European cars and BMWs come from Europe, so we're hopeful that we'll be there. There's some pretty competitive cars come out of there, but at the end of the day, I think they've been operating for a while. BMW's got a load of experience, and having said all that, we'll probably be in trouble anyway.
I think I'll be able to tell you that better in 1986. Obviously, next year is a real hodgepodge as far as unknown quantities. There's European cars, American cars, Japanese cars, and until they all get on the circuit, I wouldn't want to hazard a guess. I certainly won't be putting my money on anything until 1986. So I'll sit on the fence and watch.
Well, I don't see your car being anywhere there, Dick. I think you should stick to Queensland with your Moreton Bay Crabs, but we're doing a fair bit of homework. We'd like to see Holden out in front as usual. At this stage, we've got a lot of homework to catch up on all these European jobs that have been running for a couple of years. But you tell me what you're doing, Dick, and I'll let you know what I'm doing. But I don't think you're going to tell me, are you?
I think that you've got to look at the overseas competitors, and obviously the Jaguars, Rovers, BMWs have been running very well. The Alpha, which will be campaigning, you know, has always been winning its class, and is always there and has been very reliable. But I think turbocharged motor cars are sort of going to come into their own, and maybe not earlier in the year, but I think come Bathurst next year, maybe, you know, there'll be a new breed of motor cars, probably all turbocharged, and going nearly as quick as the cars are going to go this year.
Well, you've certainly got to look at Europe, as you've done, Dick, to see the leading cars over there. I'm trying to put a little deal together to run one of those types of cars. But you'd have to be the last bloke I'd tell that answer to.
Well, there you have it. That's the best bunch of Clayton's answers I've ever heard in my life. But for me, I'll be driving FORD, which hopefully next year will mean first on race day. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Dick Johnson. Marvellous little report there on the introduction of Group A racing to Australia. You'll see it for the first time in the James Hardy 1000 exclusively on the 7 network at the end of September. And, of course, it is the touring car category for 1985. The man who hasn't got to worry about a change of category at the moment is, of course, our race leader, Gary Scott of Queensland in the Nissan Turbo. Nicely clear at this stage, 65 seconds clear of number 8, Andrew Harris, of course, the Kmart Commodore. And then a further 5 seconds or so back to Peter McLeod in car number 50. Number 35, of course, still running back there. And strongly, as he has all day, Ron Gillard in the Mazda RX-7. 95 of 155 tours of Amaroo Park now completed. And the short straight along past the lake to Wunderlich Corner. Number 35, Ron Gillard, has been running very strongly in this race. There is Ron heading down the back straightaway, driving a course for the Goodyear Car Owners Club, and doing it very, very comfortably indeed. He was up amongst the leaders in the opening 10 circuits of the race. He's had a shunt at the front, as you can see, but that really hasn't worried him. He's been able to soldier on quite nicely. He'll be running in 4th at the moment.
Be banished from the Car Owners Club for doing that sort of damage, but I guess he can be forgiven on a day like this when the track is just so slippery, and that is the part of the track that has caused so many of the problems.
Well, he quotes his worst moment in racing when his co-driver rode off the car in the final practice in 1977. As Ron explained, he'd qualified the car very well. He had the second fastest Alpha in that event. He learned about the accident while he was walking to the showers. And someone walked over to him and said, "Bad luck about your car, Ron." He thinks that's the worst moment that he's had so far in racing. Comes from Nowra on the south coast. Motor mechanic by trade. And hobbies include rifles and bushwalking. Well, he hasn't to go walk bush today. He wouldn't want to here at Amaroo Park. But he's doing very, very comfortably indeed in 4th spot on the road. Car number 35, Ron Gillard.
He's a man with a lot of experience in motor racing, going back to 1969, when he had a class win in Morris Cooper S at Bathurst. So He's been racing for the best part of 15, 16 years. So he knows his way around most of the circuits in Australia, and this one included.
There he is coming out of Wonderlick Corner along the front straight here in Amaroo Park. Ron Gillard in the Mazda RX-7 car number 35 for the Goodyear Car Owners Club. Sponsors heading up over the top of Bitcher Pave and dropping down into Dunlop Loop.
Ron Gillard still sporting that damage at the front. I don't suppose it'd be doing too much damage aerodynamically, otherwise he wouldn't be doing so well. But it looks rather ugly. It looks as though he could swallow up any pedestrian who wandered onto the track. Never see them again.
Down to the right-hander. One thing about Ron, he does prefer long-distance racing, claiming he's got the ability to be able to pace himself and his car without damaging it. Well, I think he's showing that quite well here today, coming through the bottom corner and heading along the front straight here at Amaroo Park.
Ron Gillard currently in 4th position. One lap down on the leaders, but still a long way to go. Around about 58 laps of the Celestic 300 for 1984. The man we're watching, Ron Gillard.
Up into the top 6, of course, has moved the Mike Bergman, Bob Stevens RX-7. They've been doing quite well, and Tony Mulvihill and Brian Nightingale, who made an early pit stop and had trouble doing the driver change, round off the top 6. That's in the Celestic 300, coming to you live from Amaroo Park Raceway near Sydney. Back to Sydney's Amaroo Park Raceway battleground, a wet one today for the Celestic 300. And this young man continues to lead the event, 60 seconds up on car number 8, and we're referring, of course, to brilliant young Queenslander Gary Scott, trying to assure Nissan of a repeat win. One here with George Fury in 83, and Scott leading the pack now, 1 minute up on car number 8, Andrew Harris, and then car number 50, which of course is Peter McLeod.
He's a driver making his annual visit to Amaroo, and is the defending endurance champion. Peter's been a model of consistency all season, but like any pro, today's event for him means planning his race, but then racing to that plan.
If you're going to achieve anything, be it motor racing or in anything, you must have a plan. And certainly we have a plan for the race. It not necessarily is a very complicated one, but we have to know where we're aiming at, what we're trying to achieve, and how we're going to get to that point. And with that in mind, we've got to stick very rigidly to that plan. Of course, many things can upset the plan, and therefore you've got to have a secondary plan, something to fall back on if something goes wrong with your original idea of what you should be doing.
Yeah, just how flexible do you have to be?
Well, in motor racing, you've got to be very flexible. Anything can happen, as has been said many, many times, and you can be in front with 1 lap to go and have a problem. You can have a problem on the first lap. Other people can cause you problems. Your problems can be mechanical. They can be of fuel. They can be of tyres. They can be of driver. The weather can change. There's so many variations in the sport, and you have to be equipped to cope with them all. And I think it's the people who are best equipped is the ones who are the first home.
And if ever it was true that anything can happen, today's the day. And Peter McLeod now nestling into 3rd place, some 6 seconds behind the Andrew Harris Commodore, and another all about a lap behind Gary Scott, the leader. But there he is, Peter McLeod, after 103 laps of the 155 Celestic 300. And I wonder just how much to plan his race is going.
Well, I would think going well at the moment, you couldn't wish to be in a better situation with about 52 laps remaining in the event. A cool day, intermediate tyres, everything running nicely, and you're at the front of the pack, so that'd be good enough. They've got a 60-second advantage over Andrew Harris. Harris will wait and see whether he can pull back that gap. It's quite a task, but there are certainly enough laps to do it in. And then, of course, 6.3 seconds in arrears behind them, car number 50, Peter McLeod, that was mentioned to you.
RX-7 Track 7 is one that looks surprisingly intact. So many of the other cars have had a nudge with each other, or at least one of the walls around the Amaroo Park circuit. But Peter McLeod has managed to stay away from trouble, and as a result he's in third place and looking pretty good at this stage.
Cole Young has joined us, been helping Dick Johnson out in the pit area. Gary Scott would be looking at perhaps the biggest win of his career here at Amaroo Park this afternoon. It won't do him any harm as they go to the James Hardie 1000.
I wouldn't think so, Mike. A victory here today will be a great way to open the Australian Endurance Championship, and I think we must realise that with the weather conditions, a very tough race for drivers, a great deal of concentration required. We've seen a number of cars go off the circuit, and it's very important not to get off the line here today and to make sure that you can concentrate on the job at hand, and that's just what Gary Scott's doing. He's got the Nissan Bluebird out in front, running to a plan. He's discussed it by two-way radio with team manager Howard Marsden, and just for the rest of the race they plan just to sit out in front and keep measuring the buffer between Gary Scott and the current second place Andrew Harris, and I'll just hold that buffer, and Gary Scott I think's got a little bit up his sleeve in the wet just at the moment, and if he needs to he can probably pull out a bit more time.
Well, at this stage, still running comfortably ahead of Andrew Harris and the Commodore. And that gap seems to be opening up just a little bit. Was about 60 seconds. It's opened up just a little bit more.
The tyres on the Nissan Bluebird are a racing compound that's normally used for their slick. In fact, Gary Scott running a grooved slick here today, a tyre that they would normally use in the dry, but hand groove with grooves in it to wash away the water, and the track just at that intermediate stage where it's not completely awash and it's not completely dry, and it seems that Howard Marsden, the very experienced Nissan team manager, has made a great tactical move here in tyre selection for Gary Scott's Bluebird.
Still following the number 50 car, must be due shortly for pit stop. We'll wait and see. Crew, we believe, are waiting down there. We'll bring in Dick Johnson as we get closer to it. Graham Bailey, of course, is taking over from Peter. Activity down there in the pit area. Dick Johnson. The rain's certainly not getting any lighter.
No, it certainly isn't, Mike, and there's one car here which appears it's a slick 50 car, but they could be doing a pit stop for one of the other cars to put on some wet weather tyres, and I'd say that would be the car number 35 that they're going to do the pit stop for, and they're full wet Goodyear tyres they're going to put on them, Mike. But also there's a lot of cars here today have had gearbox problems. Colin Bond came in the Freddie Geisler car with a gearbox problem. They're now changing the gearbox to go back out in the race because they maintain at this rate there'll only be 4 or 5 cars left. So they'll be right. They'll be able to cop a place and get a few dollars out of their trouble for the day. But it seems as though that all these cars must be using Pavlovas in the gearbox, Mike.
Nicely put. Well, about 49 laps remaining in the running of the Scholastic 300 for 1984. Car number 50 circulates around. Our race leader is still Gary Scott. McLeod still there in third spot. The gap between Gary Scott in car number 16 and Andrew Harris in the Kmart Commodore down from 60 seconds in the last couple of laps to around about 47.5 seconds. So if he can shave it at a second a lap, we're in for a photo finish to the Scholastic 300. The Slick 50 car driven by Peter McLeod, 6.3 seconds back behind the number 8 car presently driven by Andrew Harris. So there's still a few questions left unanswered in the Scholastic 300 from Amaroo Park. To Amaroo Park Raceway, Howard Marsden just checking the times for Gary Scott. They've been somewhat concerned the last few laps. As I mentioned before going to the break, we had Gary Scott in car number 16 with about a 65-second lead. In the space of the last 12 laps, Andrew Harris in the number 8 Kmart Commodore has been able to whittle that back now to 43 seconds. He's been able to carve a sizable chunk off that with a further 9.1 seconds. Then back to Peter McLeod in car number 50, and that gap between Gary Scott and Andrew Harris in the Kmart Commodore is dropping all the time, now down to 41.5 seconds.
Yes, if he keeps that up, we've got about 46 laps to go, and so he's only got to narrow that gap less than a second a lap to make a real go of it towards the end. But we think that Gary Scott won't have to make another pit stop, so he may be laughing if Andrew Harris does have to call in once more. There's our leader, Gary Scott.
Well, there's car number 8, the one driven by Andrew Harris. The more I think about it, with Gary Scott being able to just ease off a little bit, allow that gap to come down, Howard Marsden has been able, I think, to precipitate Scott into a little more forward travel, and he's starting to pick the pace up again now. So I think Gary Scott was just wisely setting his own pace. The conditions aren't, at this stage, very, very favourable. And from that 41 seconds, they've now dipped out to a 50 seconds, so he's been able to pick the pace up by about 6 seconds.
Gary Scott in constant radio contact with his pit area, Howard Marsden and Derek Rawson, who's the chief engine man, talking to Gary Scott on a regular basis, and they're keeping him informed of the gap between himself and Andrew Harris in the Kmart Commodore. And I'm sure that they've given Gary Scott the message that the gap was just coming down a little bit too close for comfort, and I'm sure we'll see it being kept at around a steady 45 to 50 seconds as long as the race continues.
Well, Mark Gibbs here in the Mazda behind Andrew Harris. They come onto the straight. You see the track very, very wet indeed, heading up Bitchapave Hill. There he goes, heading up to the top of the hill. They've already had a pit stop. And that gap again opening up with Harris to 46 seconds. So Scott, as you said, Cole, has been able to just settle the pace, and he is driving the race according to the way that Howard Marsden wants it to be run.
I think the other thing to consider here too is today's conditions, well, not all that enjoyable for drivers, but if any driver is enjoying them, Gary Scott may just well be the man. He spent 2 seasons in England in 1977 and 78 racing Formula 2 and Formula 3, and the weather conditions over there are very typical of the day we have today here in Sydney, and he did plenty of wet weather driving against some very hot competition, including in the 1977 season a driver by the name of Nelson Piquet, who also ran the Formula 3 series in England that year. So maybe those couple of seasons in England are paying off today for Gary Scott on his way to trying to take out this Scholastic 300 race.
As we say, that gap up to 46 seconds now between Scott and Andrew Harris, although I wonder if it's not so much Scott putting the foot down as Andrew Harris easing off, because Peter McLeod in the Mazda is also narrowing the gap between himself and Andrew Harris.
35, still back in 4th place, is of course Ron Gillard. Mark Gibbs at the wheel of the car at the moment. We've already dealt with them early in the race, the Goodyear Car Owners Club, and they've done very, very well. They were in to do a pit stop only a short time ago, and they are still running very strongly in 4th place. 33 is the next one back behind them in 5th spot.
Gary Scott has actually been going around a little quicker, 65 seconds down to 62 and then 61. So he's got the message.
Well, there comes Gibbs out of the corner, our race leader, of course, with lap 114 of 155. And Gary Scott of Queensland continues as the race leader of the Scholastic 300. Let's look at some details about this young Queenslander. 31 years of age. Good on you, Brisbane. Driving the Bluebird Turbo. Been in racing for 9 years, so he's no chicken, or he's not new to the sport. 77, winner of the National Formula 3 in a cheetah. 78, he raced Formula 3 in Europe and UK. 82, third at Bathurst with John Harvey. Keeping in mind he did drive with the dealer team. And the front row of the grid for every Amaroo race in 84. And doesn't that tell you something, Steve Rebellion?
Well, it does, and he'll be pleased that Steve Masterton isn't still circulating, because a couple of times during the year, especially in the AMSCAR series, he's been shunted off the track one way or another, and it's usually besides Steve Masterton that those little incidents have occurred. So Steve Masterton no longer in it, but Gary Scott certainly is. Doing it very comfortably. And seems to have the measure of the other drivers just at the moment. As he takes it down into the late corner once more. And pretty gingerly, they're all taking it carefully around there. And into Wonderlick. And back up into pit straight once more.
We saw on the statistics which were just up for Gary Scott that he did a stint with the Holden dealer team, running third at Bathurst with John Harvey. And I would say earlier in the race when we saw a dice between Gary Scott and Peter Brock, his former boss at the dealer team, I'd say Gary Scott would have been enjoying that running wheel to wheel with his former boss at the Holden dealer team. But Gary Scott and the Nissan Bluebird out in front, driving a very comfortable and sensible race at this stage, using Avon brand intermediate wet weather tyres for this race. Started the race on slicks, which was a brave move in the wet conditions, but they've paid off. We heard Dick Johnson just mention a little while ago when the car 35 came into the pit area, they changed to a full wet weather tread pattern on the Goodyear car owner's car. And in fact, Mike Raymond earlier in the race, the pit area was very much a delight for the tyre people. There were all sorts of brands being floated around. Peter Brock, in fact, had 3 brands in the pit area ready to go on his Commodore at various stages of the race.
Well, he might have been calling into that other stop as well, but he got taken into the pit area with that mix-up with a slower car that's put him out of the race. About 42 seconds the gap between Gary Scott in car number 16 and Andrew Harris in car number 8. 11 seconds then back to Peter McLeod in car number 50. And then a couple of laps down behind them, Ron Gillard in car number 35. Okay, down to the pit area now, and here's Dick Johnson.
Thanks, Mike. With me, I have Ivan Stibbard, who is the promoter running this meeting. And I've just been informed from Ivan that the race has been reduced to 140 laps.
That's right, Dick. The times have dropped dramatically. The rain's not improving, and the darkness is closing in. So we decided we'd shoot for cutting the race by 15 laps.
Mike, I can assure you that I don't think there'd be one driver out there would be sorry that the race has been reduced by 15 laps.
Thank you very much, Dick Johnson, and to Ivan Stibbard. That puts the matter into true perspective for the Scholastic 300. I don't think it's going to make too much difference if this man out in front continues to drive as well as he's driven for 118 circuits already completed. There's car number 21, Graham Lusty, co-driving with John Lusty. They qualified 19th in the field, so they started a long way back, but they've been able to certainly stay on the same scoreboard as the top 8 runners anyway.
One of the teams that took a punt early in the race by selecting to run on the slick compound tyres, which are normally used in dry weather. So early in the race, they were like a lot of other teams, unable to keep up with the front running pace of the drivers who had decided to use a treaded type tyre. But now Graham and John Lusty have made their mid-race pit stop, and they're back onto the more sensible treaded tyres for this type of weather conditions and running along at quite a steady pace, but 2 laps down on the leader.
There's Lusty in number 21, the V8 Commodore, 8th on the road at the moment.
Started on the back row of the grid, but grid positions haven't meant a hell of a lot today when cars have been dropping out at a great rate, and lap times have been anything but like the ones that we saw yesterday for practice when the lap record was given a good old shake.
Lusty goes down to the Lake Corner through the gears, the short run down to Wonderlick Corner now. And, of course, also making up the field today, you could say a veteran and a rookie in car number 29. That, of course, is Paul Jones, and co-driving with Paul today is Glenn Seaton. Paul's been a regular here at Amaroo Park in the Freedom Fencing entry. Unfortunately, was taken out of action 2 meetings back in the accident where Ken Matthews upended his car in the Dunlop Loop. They missed the last meeting, but they're back and racing, and at the present time they're running 9th in the field. Heading down to Mazda Corner, Paul Jones and young Glenn Seaton, the son of Bo Seaton, the man that's probably won more Ford Capri races around Amaroo Park and more Ford Capri placings in the Bathurst Enduro. And that looks like young Glenn Seaton at the wheel, heading down to the bottom corner through the gears. And now you can see that's where they're running on the track behind Lusty at the moment. Lusty in 8th and Glenn Seaton in 9th place. And doing a good job in that big Ford. It's not really the car you want to be running here in the wet. But it's a beautifully turned out car, and full credit, of course, goes to Paul Jones, who prepares it, and Glenn Seaton, who's only 19 years of age, apprentice mechanic, the chief mechanic, in fact, for his dad, Barry Seaton. He loves to go racing, and his ambition in racing is to be as good as Peter Brock. Well, Glenn Seaton continues. He's running 9th. Gary Scott is at the head of the field, and the Scholastic 300 continues at Amaroo Park. To Amaroo Park Raceway, Castrol, oils ain't oils. 122 laps of 140 laps completed in this year's Scholastic 300. Gary Scott of Queensland is your race leader in car 16, the Nissan Turbo. Car number 8, the Andrew Harris, Ron Harrop Commodore is in second. 50, Peter McLeod in the Slick 50 entry. Then in 4th place, Mike Bergman and Bob Stevens in the Mazda RX-7. And then 35, Ron Gillard and Gibbs in an RX-7. Our thanks go to Castrol, of course, sponsoring the Castrol scoreboard for 7's major motorsporting presentations.
There's the rather wet scene as Gary Scott ploughs his way through the precipitation. Not that it's raining that hard, but it's getting pretty gloomy. And I think really the correct decision made there by the ARDC to shorten the race a little. Otherwise we'll be calling for spotlights.
Well, we've got about 16 laps shy now of the finish of the event. About 40.7 the gap from our race leader Gary Scott to Andrew Harris in car number 8, and then a further 10 back to car number 50, the Peter McLeod Graham Bailey entry. So they've held their station. There's no one really there to challenge them. I think probably a couple of laps down on them would be Mike Bergman in car number 33. Co-driver is, of course, Bob Stevens. That's another Mazda RX-7. So a Nissan Turbo leads the fleet, a Commodore in 2nd place, then a group of Mazda RX-7s in 3rd, 4th and 5th and 6th.
And with 15 laps remaining in the Scholastic 300, Gary Scott on the Nissan Bluebird Turbo leading the field, as was his teammate George Fury at the same stage of this race last year. And barring misfortune, a repeat win for the Nissan Bluebird team coming up. The gap between Scott and the 2nd place Andrew Harris Commodore now 41.4 seconds, so it seems Scott is content to keep that margin around 40-41 seconds between himself and Andrew Harris.
Well, Gary Scott has had wet conditions outside the car today. Or a fella who's been out in the wet practically all day is our pitman, Dick Johnson.
Thanks, Mike. Well, there's very, very little happening in the pits at the moment. As you can see, there's not that many cars left in the race, but the ones that are there are still going around. I noticed that on the very slow corner down there at Winfield that the Slick 50 car of Peter McLeod is having some trouble getting gears. So I suppose it's up to him whether he finishes the race or not, but I sincerely hope that for his sake he can continue on and finish the race in the position that he is in.
Thanks, Dick. Well, Dick Johnson doing a good job for us down in the pit area today, stepping out of a race car, and I think he's handled the job superbly, being able to bring us up to date with what has in fact been happening in the pit area. It's not a bad initiation, though, to motorsports commentary, though, to get the pit job and have a wet day.
Yes, he's been a busy man, and he's been doing a great job. And, well, there's been plenty happening. People changing tyres, changing them back again. Peter Brock running into trouble and ruining his front end, trying to get into the pits. And as he came into the pits, he had slicks on his car. I guess that might have been partly the problem, because he ran into a puddle and skidded into trouble.
Well, the Scholastic 300 continues at Amaroo Park Raceway. Gary Scott of Queensland is the leader. A big day on sport on 7. Let's go back to 7 Sports Centre and to Terry Willisey. Welcome back to Amaroo Park. Our thanks there for Terry Willisey updating you on all the sport It's been happening around Australia and the world today. We're now following car number 8, the Kmart Commodore, which of course is running in second place at the moment. And it is back about 40 seconds behind our race leader, Andrew Harris. The car, as we mentioned before, was to have been driven by Warren Cullen, but he handed over to Ronnie Harrop.
If you think that's a comfortable gap, Mike, it's interesting between 8th and 9th. Between 29, the Paul Jones Glen Seaton Falcon, and 37 is 9th. That's the Graham and Ian Stones Mazda. The gap a tidy 84 laps.
Well, 128, and if the gap's closing, I bet they'll be really pleased that it's gone from 155 to 140. 36 the difference, but then again Gary Scott, as we've been informed from the pit area, has been able to just pick up the pace whenever he wants to.
Andrew Harris in the Kmart Commodore running in second place. He teamed with Ron Harrop in this race. Ron Harrop, a last-minute replacement for Warren Cullen, wasn't feeling too well. This will be one of 2 of the Kmart Commodores that will be running the James Hardy 1000 later this year. And of course, former world champion Alan Jones joining this team for the James Hardy 1000 and the Castrol 500 at Sandown.
Interesting to see the Kmart team have removed that grill, which had worked itself loose, getting a little bit of moisture in there on the radiator. But as we mentioned, no one's going to be overheating today.
Weather conditions probably in some respects a blessing in disguise for the Nissan team. The turbocharged Nissan cars normally perform a little bit better when conditions are cooler. The hot weather and the higher temperatures of the turbo operation sometimes give those cars problems. So I would say that Howard Marsden and the Nissan team, despite the uncomfortable weather conditions, quite happy to see a cooler temperature today for the Scholastic 300.
Well, I would think that Warren Cullen would be quite happy with the way his 2 lads have been able to steer car number 8 around Dick Johnson after stepping out of the seat feeling a little ill this morning.
Certainly. Well, Warren actually has been in the pit all day here, and by the way, he looked so wet before, I think he might have pneumonia by the time the day is finished. But I think under the conditions that the guys are driving under there, the track is probably as slippery as a butcher's block at the moment, and I reckon their tyres will be getting a little bit second-hand, seeing as they're getting towards the end of the race. So I reckon most of them would be feeling worth stopping right now.
Well, the 140 lap mark with 10 remaining certainly suiting our race leader at the moment, Gary Scott. Been able to pick the pace up again. It's now up to 40 seconds over car number 8, Harris, and then of course Peter McLeod 10 seconds in arrears in 3rd place. The Scholastic 300 continues at Amaroo Park.
Welcome back to a rather gloomy and wet Amaroo Park, where Gary Scott, with 9 laps to go, leads the Scholastic 300. From car number 8, Andrew Harris, the Ron Harrop, Andrew Harris Commodore, then Peter McLeod in the Mazda, and then Mike Bergman and Ron Gillard in the Mazda RX-7. Pretty wet, pretty miserable, but a pretty handy lead enjoyed by Gary Scott. Although it has come down to 30 seconds, he's leading from Andrew Harris. And with 9 laps to go, you wonder whether that's enough for that gap to be made up by the Andrew Harris machine.
Harris, of course, would have to pick up around about 3 seconds per lap between now and the end of the race to make up that gap, and I think under the conditions it would be a fairly tough task for any of these drivers, and it may be, and in fact I'm certain that Howard Marsden has advised Gary Scott by radio that the race has been shortened and is running the pace for Gary Scott with about a 30-second lead over Andrew Harris.
Windscreen wiper still going, just clipping the curb on the run-through Dunlop Loop. Gary Scott, young Queenslander, with a 29-second lead over car number 8, the one driven by Andrew Harris, the Commodore V8. Peter McLeod, Graham Bailey, Slick 50, Mazda RX-7 back in 3rd, and then Mike Bergman, and of course Bob Stevens in the number 33 Mazda RX-7. Well, Scott, I think, just knows he's got a handful of laps to finish this off. If he can keep his 20 or 30-second lead up there, there is no way in the world anyone's going to put any pressure on him. Be far better attacking it and making sure that he makes no attempt to pass some of these slower cars in difficult parts of the racetrack, just for fear that they haven't spotted him coming up from behind. And he's setting just a comfortable pace. Howard Marsden would be delighted to found reliability in this race once again. In 1984, they found it. 83 with George Fury. I think George Fury would be delighted to see at the moment one of his Nissan drivers for Bathurst and the James Hardy up front and leading the race that he won last year.
Well, of course, Gary Scott and George Fury. There's Howard Marsden, the Nissan team manager. Just having a word to the radio man, no doubt a message through to Gary Scott with 5 laps remaining in the Scholastic 300, shortened from 155 to 140, so 135 laps of the Scholastic 300 completed. And Gary Scott and George Fury teaming in a Bluebird for the James Hardy 1000 in the long distance races. There's Fred Gibson. His wife Christine Gibson drove the Exa Turbo Coupe here today, standing there in the rain taking a look at how Gary Scott comes past their pit area actually and onto the straight to complete another lap.
I would say not one member of the Nissan team or the pit team would even feel wet. They're more interested in getting this car home for a win with about 4 laps remaining in the Scholastic 300 for 84. 25 seconds the gap. Gary Scott of Queensland, the race leader, on screen at the moment, dropping into Dunlop Blue. Andrew Harris in the Kmart Commodore, car number 8, in second spot, and 9 seconds back behind Andrew Harris is, of course, the Bailey Peter McLeod Slick 50 entry, the Mazda RX-7.
Yes, the Nissan team would all be filled with that inner warmth, I think, right at the moment, Mike.
And nice for a young guy like Gary Scott, who's one of the emerging forces in touring car racing in Australia. Has a strong international reputation, drives well in the wet, and people, the experience that he has gained here today of doing 300 Ks or just under 300 Ks in the wet will hold him instead for the James Hardy 1000, because you never know, one of these years, someone once said there is going to be another wet full day of the 1,000 kilometre race at Bathurst, and it's nice to have that wet weather experience when you go to Mount Panorama.
It hasn't exactly been a dry winter in Sydney, but it just seems that every time we roll around to an Amaroo meeting, it's nice and dry, except for, I think, the once this year. And so the drivers haven't had a lot of wet weather tracks to practice on. And a few of them today have been found wanting on the track they went.
I don't think they'll complain after today. About 270 Ks of wet weather driving. Gary Scott, 16, the Nissan Turbo, exits Honda Corner on the run down past the lake to the right-hander. 23 seconds still in front. There's Howard Marsden. He's gone for the briefcase. Don't know if the Valiums are out as yet, or he's still checking the top. He's got a smile on his face, and Howard, I would think, would be happy at this stage. Coming up with about 2 laps remaining. The Jones-Seaton Ford just ahead of Gary Scott on the road as they head up. Lusty one back from them. But Scott heads up the hill with about a lap and 3/4, if we make it, remaining in the Scholastic 300 Ks. Shortened by 15 tours today because of the obvious weather conditions. The Warren Cullen entered, Ron Harrop, Andrew Harris, Kmart Commodore V8 running in second on the road at the moment. 23 seconds in arrears and 9 seconds further back to the Bailey and McLeod. Well, Howard Marsden, I would think, would be a very, very happy man at this stage. Correct, Dick Johnson?
Yes, Mike. Actually, I was just about to ask Howard. Howard, now that you're in a position where it looks as though with a couple of laps remaining that you are in a tremendous position to win the race, but does this mean that in the future races, the long-distance races, that the car will be as reliable?
Yes, obviously your question is aimed at the fact we haven't put a lot of mechanical stress into the cars.
Yes, well, you know, today's conditions do sort of make the cars a little easier on it, doesn't it?
That's right, and we quite agree that that is so, but we're still very confident. We think that when it gets dry, with what we've learned through this year, that we may well be in a position to even give you a hard time in the long-distance races, Dickie.
I wish you all the best, Howard.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Dick Johnson. About half a lap away from victory. What was to be a win in 1983 in the Scholastic 300 has turned out to be a repeat win in 1984 for Gary Scott.
And the gap between Scott and Andrew Harris down now to 19 seconds as Gary Scott comes through Honda Corner down towards the Lake Corner, coming up to complete the race. But I would say plenty of margin for him virtually now to coast across the finish line to win the Scholastic 300.
Gary Scott, 31 years of age, from Queensland, comes along the short straight to Wonderlic Corner for the final time. The hand is already out. He would be jubilant because he's coming through to go on and win the Scholastic 300. The first round of the Endurance Championship goes to the young Queenslander in the Nissan Turbo Bluebird. He's won it. Second place will go to the Warren Cullen-entered Ron Harrop, Andrew Harris, Kmart Commodore, V8 car number 8. And third place will go to Peter McLeod and Graham Bailey in the Mazda RX-7. There's second place going across the line, and Castrol Scoring Service provides us now with a rundown of the top finishers. Gary Scott of Queensland in 16, the winner. Ron Harrop and, of course, Andrew Harris in car number 8 finish in second spot. Peter McLeod and Graham Bailey finish in third in an RX-7. Car number 33 is Mike Bergman, and Bob Stevens finish fourth. And Ron Gillard and Gibbs in another RX-7 finish in fifth place. That information courtesy of the Castrol scoreboard. And Castrol, of course, joining us for all the major 7 motorsporting presentations. We'll see them again at the James Hardy 1000. We'll take a break and come back. There's a lot more action, including the Alfa Romeo final to go.
A race in which you had to make the right decisions to come out in front, and the man who did that was Gary Scott. Gary, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yep, the Nissan team seemed to make all the right decisions today. It all came down to tyres in the end, didn't it?
Yes, we were on the right tyres at the start. It was right till the warm-up we didn't know what to do, and I just said, no, it's slicks and that's it. And I feel it's terrific that we've won today because we've had a bit of bad luck this year here at Amaroo, and the boys have given me a brilliant car. I've known it can win, and today it just shows everyone in Australia what a great little car she is.
And just to relate a couple of the incidents that happened during the year, you and Steve Masterton came together more than once.
Yeah, that's motor racing.
All right, we won't go any further into it, but what we might do is straight away have a little presentation for you, and Bambi Staveley is going to do the honours, and the honours for the Scholastic 300.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you. Dow Corning are once again proud to be sponsors of the Scholastic 300. It was a great day for us, even though the weather was a bit bad. Must have been bad for you with the road being slippery, but congratulations.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Gary, but we shouldn't forget the second place getters, Ron Harris and Andrew Harris. Are you going to come forward? Ron Harrop, that's a bit of a mouthful. We've been struggling with it all day. Yes. Congratulations, Andrew.
Thanks very much.
Any major problems?
No, none at all. The car went like a dream. In fact, we lost our lead driver, Warren Cullen, this morning. He's very, very sick with the flu. So Ron took over the number 1 position, and we were tickled pink. You know, the car went well, and we drove a race 2-time on the right tyres, and we got the result.
I'm sure you haven't had a chance to talk to Warren, but I'm sure he'll be very pleased with the way you went.
So, I mean, it's been a long time between drinks for Kmart and Eveready, so we're glad we've given them a drink at last.
Andrew and Ron, well done.
Thank you.
And finally, Peter McLeod, if you'd like to come forward. Peter, what about your choice of tyres at the start?
Oh, we're very happy with the choice of tyres. It would have been nice to have had a few more gears. We only had 2 gears for the 138 laps of the race, 4th and 5th, and it meant the car just completely stopped down at the 2 stop corners. And that was a pity, but that's motor racing. We were 3rd last year, 3rd again this year. Maybe we'll break that duck shortly. But for what the car, the guys who put it together, it was brilliant. The car has been beautifully prepared, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the Enduro series.
Yes, we saw you suffering up straight and going up Bitcher Pavia. You were really struggling.
Yeah, I reckon it was costing me a second and a half a lap, actually. It was so bad in 5th gear.
All right, Peter, congratulations, well done. 3rd, but it could have been better. A bit of a sad story, but do you think even if it had been perfect, the car had been running perfectly, could you have caught Gary?
Oh, well, you know, you race the day on the day, and Gary won today, and congratulations to him. He drove a beaut race, and so did the Kmart boys. And we've come up, and I'm happy with that. It gives me points in the championship, and that's what I want.
Okay, Peter, thanks very much indeed. The place getters, an interesting race, a race of great attrition eventually, because I think only about 9 or 10 fellas finished. But let's hear now from Mike Raymond.